British Airways Flight 5390. On June 10th of 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 was en route flying from Birmingham to Malaga, Spain. However, shortly after taking off, just 13 minutes into the flight,
a large bang could be heard from the cockpit of the plane, and the cabin quickly filled with condensation.
What had happened was the left window
in the cockpit had burst open,
and a man by the name of Timothy Lancaster,
who was the captain of the plane, was sucked out the window.
However, as he was getting sucked out the window, his knee got caught on the control panel, and so he got stuck hanging halfway out of the plane while they're flying. Fortunately, a flight attendant by the name of Nigel Ogden ran up to him and grabbed him by the waist and held on to him so he wouldn't fly out of the plane. Of course, immediately the co-pilot started trying to bring the plane down. They tried to pull him in, but the force of the wind was too strong to actually make it happen. 20 minutes after the explosion, they finally got the plane landed in Southampton Airport, and after being taken to the hospital, the captain, who had been sucked halfway out of the plane for 20 minutes, actually did survive. Although he did get quite a few pretty bad injuries, including frostbite. It turns out that the window that had blown out had been recently installed, and when they installed it, they put the wrong screws in it. Ben Carpenter. The story of Ben Carpenter is just insane. In 2007, Ben Carpenter was a 21-year-old man who used an electric wheelchair.
He was in a town in Michigan called Paw Paw,
and one day he was crossing the street alongside a caregiver. However, as he was crossing the intersection, the light turned green and a semi-truck pulled forward, and Ben's wheelchair ended up getting wedged into the front grille of the semi-truck, and the semi-truck just drove off with him wedged into it. Like, it just started pushing him down the road. The semi-truck promptly went onto the highway with Ben stuck to it.
And apparently they got up to 50 miles per hour. Quite a few people on the road saw what was happening and called the police.
But around 3 or 4 miles into the drive,
it seems like the truck driver was flagged down by a police officer, and they pulled over and realized what was happening.
Miraculously, Ben was completely unscathed after this. His wheelchair held up pretty well. Kidney transplant. Usually when people get kidney transplants, the old kidneys are not actually removed. The new ones are put in, but the old ones are just kind of left there. This is just because it's pretty involved to get them removed, and for most surgeons, it's not worth the risk of trying to take them out if they can just kind of sit there and do nothing anyway. And so, another weird thing about kidney transplants is the new kidney is usually put in a different place than where your old kidneys were. They're usually put
lower on your body, more in your pelvis region,
as opposed like up where your kidneys normally are. This video is sponsored by NordVPN.
To make this video, I had to do some research on some really strange parts of the internet, and I like being extra careful keeping my data and privacy secure. And so this is where NordVPN comes in. If you're someone who uses public Wi-Fi a lot,
whether it be airports, cafes, hotels, the assumption is that if it works, it's probably fine. In reality though, much of the time these networks are often pretty insecure and leave your data pretty vulnerable. NordVPN encrypts your internet traffic, which helps prevent third parties from accessing your activity. In addition to the VPN itself, NordVPN also provides an additional service called Threat Protection Pro. This tool scans websites for phishing attacks, it blocks malicious ads, and it even detects fake online storefronts. You can get the NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 extra months if you visit nordvpn.com/parallelvpn. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The North Korean Zoo. North Korea has a zoo. It was opened in 1959 and it's located in Pyongyang. Now, I don't really think there's much use in just dunking on the North Korean Zoo, but you know, as you might imagine, the treatment of the animals at the zoo is likely not very good. In 2016, a report came out that they had a chimpanzee that would smoke a pack a day. There have also been other clips and photos that have come out of the environments that the animals live in, and it's not really stuff you like to see. In the past, they've also made animals fight each other before. Although it seems like there have been times where things have improved, it's hard to tell exactly what the state of the zoo is now and what the current trajectory of it really is. The Carrington event.
Sometimes the sun will eject clouds of plasma and magnetic fields towards Earth. Usually the Earth is able to deflect and protect against most of this thanks to its magnetosphere. Usually this stuff just causes some localized auroras across Earth, but as these geomagnetic storms get more powerful, they can start causing issues with electronics on Earth.
The Carrington event was a geomagnetic storm that was so powerful that people reported seeing the aurora all over the Earth,
as far south as Colombia.
And in some places, it was so bright that it said that you'd be able to go outside at night and read a newspaper under the light emitted by the aurora. Apparently, some gold miners in the Rocky Mountains were woken up in the middle of the night due to the aurora, and they started making breakfast because they thought it was morning. It was so bright. Now, this geomagnetic storm took place back in 1859. You know, back when there weren't really a lot of electronics yet, but of the electronics that did exist at the time, they did get wrecked. Apparently, telegraphs all over the United States and Europe just completely went out. Some of them started sparking. What's kind of concerning about this is if a solar storm like that hit today, the damages that it would do thanks to knocking out electronics in the internet and telephone lines
could potentially be pretty enormous,
with some estimates saying that it would probably do upwards of $2 trillion in damages.
Although this 2.6 trillion estimate seems to be on the higher end of things, with other sources seeming more optimistic on the amount of damages that would actually be done.
Fortunately, these types of solar storms
don't seem to happen very frequently, with some estimates saying that they'll happen every 500 years, but also at the same time, they seem pretty difficult to predict.
I think this is one you just kind of have to cross your fingers with. 2010 Copiapo mining accident. The longest time anyone has ever been trapped underground took place during the 2010 Copiapo mining accident. So there is a mine located in Chile
called the San Jose Mine.
Historically, it has a pretty spotty record when it comes to safety. There's actually quite a few incidents that have occurred at this place over the years. However, on August 5th of 2010, things would come to a head with a pretty big disaster, largely just due to negligence and failure to take proper care of the mine by the owners,
the San Esteban Mining Company.
There would be a collapse in the mine, leading 33 men to be stuck underground with no tunnel or path out of the mine. Fortunately, there was like an emergency shelter towards the bottom of the mine that hypothetically the miners would have been able to stay in for some time, but they didn't even end up doing that due to there being ventilation issues with the area. There were a lot of interesting interviews done with the men who were stuck in this mine shaft. The way they talk about surviving amongst each other underground is very interesting and scary to think about. In one interview, a miner said, "Each day, a different person took a bad turn. Every time that happened, we worked as a team to try and keep the morale up. We knew that if society broke down, we would all be doomed." Some older miners helped to support the younger men, but they had all taken an oath of silence not to reveal certain details of what had occurred down in the mine, particularly during the early weeks of desperation. Exactly what took place down there? We may never know. This rescue mission was just incredibly dark and grueling because it wasn't even until 17 days after the collapse did people on the surface realize that the miners were even still alive. They had sent a small probe drill
that ended up digging into the part of the mine they were stuck in,
and the men were able to basically
attach a note to the drill
so that when it came back up to the surface, people would know that they were down there. Not long after they were discovered, they were able to send a camera down to get footage of them, and it became pretty clear that the men were not in great condition. And the rescue plan that they ultimately ended up settling on basically involved drilling a giant hole down to where the men were and installing a mini elevator that they would use to bring the men out one at a time. The problem with that, though, is getting the hole dug out and getting all that installed just takes a lot of time. And so the men were trapped underground for 69 days before they were finally able to be rescued. Miraculously, all of the men actually did survive.
Following this incident, the mining company that was responsible was dissolved, and the rescued miners were awarded some money. However, from what I can tell, in the end, no one was held criminally liable, which is pretty crazy. Blind sight. Blind sight is a condition where someone has gone blind due to damage to their visual cortex, and of course they're no longer able to consciously see anything anymore. Despite being blind though, they're still able to respond to visual stimuli that they don't even consciously see. Some people with blind sight, even if they can't consciously see it, when they're shown images of people's faces, they're able to determine what the emotions are on the faces. And there's also similar things people with blind sight can sometimes do, such as determine the location of objects around them or even navigate themselves in 3D space. For example, this is a video that reportedly shows a man who is blind, but thanks to his blind sight, he's actually able to navigate this hallway and dodge the obstacles. Now, of course, there isn't really a perfect explanation out there of how this works, but what seems to be generally believed is that your brain just happens to route visual information to a lot of different places in your brain, and it's possible that it could be routed somewhere that you're not consciously aware of, but will still allow your brain to process the information in some capacity. It's pretty unsettling to think about your brain processing information about your surroundings and you're not even consciously aware of it, and it can even affect your actions. Howard Doley and the transorbital lobotomy. So a transorbital lobotomy, also known as an ice pick lobotomy, was a very horrifying medical procedure that was sometimes practiced starting in the 40s up until the 60s. And what it was an ice pick type tool would be inserted through somebody's eyes, and the idea is that you would use this ice pick to basically reach in and sever and damage connections in their frontal lobe. This was done basically by using a mallet to hit on the ice pick to create force and to break in and sever the connection. The idea was that this would be a treatment option for extremely severe cases of mental illness where it seems like nothing else is working. Although there are some instances of it sort of working, in a lot of the ice pick lobotomy cases, it would, of course, just end up leaving the patient with severe cognitive impairment and personality changes and leave them just kind of a shell of their former selves. So this brings us to the case of Howard Doley. Howard Doley is a guy who, at the age of 12 in 1960, received an ice pick lobotomy. What's interesting about Howard Doley, though, is his parents never told him why he needed the lobotomy, and no one else around him told him either. What's also remarkable about the case of Howard Doley is he recovered really well. The lobotomy certainly negatively impacted him and made certain things in life harder. However, all things considered, he ended up recovering pretty well. If you listen to interviews of him talking, it's not obvious at all that he had a lobotomy.
The doctor said that I was getting tests and I was not to know. I didn't even know it had been done when I was there. I didn't know it was going to be done. I didn't know it was done until 3 weeks afterwards when I was told by Freeman.
Well, 45 years after he had received the lobotomy, he was able to get his hands on some old medical records to figure out what had happened. And the reason that was pretty much uncovered for why he got the lobotomy is pretty horrible. Basically, what seems to have happened is Howard Doley had a stepmom that thought he was unruly and she felt like she couldn't control him, and she had him see a physician by the name of Walter Freeman. And Walter Freeman suggested that Howard might be schizophrenic and a lobotomy might help put him on the right route in life. But it's pretty paramount to note that it seems like the household that Howard Doley lived in with his stepmom was probably pretty abusive. Not to mention other physicians had looked over Howard and they didn't believe he was schizophrenic at all. They just thought he just had the attributes of a preteen boy. And the complaints that the stepmom lists about Howard don't really seem that out of line for a 12-year-old boy, honestly. What a lot of this basically seems to be suggesting is that Howard's stepmom just really didn't like him and thought he needed a lobotomy. Apparently, Howard's dad was not initially on board with the idea, but the stepmom just continuously kept pressuring him to agree to doing it. And eventually he just did. And I want to take this as an opportunity to transition into talking about Walter Freeman more.
Walter Freeman was probably one of the biggest proponents of the ice pick lobotomy.
He was the one who gave Howard Doley it. And one of the reasons he was such a large proponent of this procedure is he argued
it could be performed easily by someone with little training.
Like, that was the strength of it. It was just like a quick and easy, boom, done. Walter Freeman played a very large role in popularizing the procedure. He literally traveled the country giving people lobotomies, and he was kind of a showman about it. During his run, it's said that he probably performed like
2,500 lobotomies and probably ended up just killing straight up quite a few people doing this.
At one point, he accidentally killed a guy because he had put the pick into the patient's brain and he'd step away to take a medical photo. But as he was stepping away, the pick ended up lodging itself farther into the brain of the patient than it was supposed to, and it ended up killing him. Also, a lot of the time, Walter Freeman would perform this procedure not in a sterile environment. Also, at one point, Walter Freeman was tasked with performing a lobotomy on John F. Kennedy's sister, and it went really bad, leaving her just a complete shell of her former self.
It wasn't an ice pick lobotomy, but it still was a lobotomy and it didn't go well.
CIA Mars exploration. So every couple years or so, the CIA will declassify some files that they had about previous projects they did. And in 2000, they declassified a very bizarre file where they said on May 22nd of 1984, the CIA had hired a psychic to remote view Mars 1 million years in the past and to tell them what they saw. Of course, I'm sure most of you guys know this, but remote viewing is this kind of like pseudoscientific psychic ability some are said to have, where in your mind's eye, you can see locations that are not around you. The document says what they saw were pyramids, a collapsed alien civilization. The aliens were like these tall, lanky creatures. This is a 100% real document. You can go to the CIA's reading vault online, like on their website, and it's there.
Now, I need to look into this remote viewing thing a little bit more, do some more research, but kind of my read on the situation is the reason the CIA was willing to try out something as weird as remote viewing is because they thought it might have like a spying application, like you might be able to use remote viewing to spy on an adversary. And they were worried that if they didn't try it out, they might not be keeping up with the Soviet Union.
Insulin coma therapy. I'm sure many of you guys know this, but of course, insulin is a hormone that your body produces. It allows you to process sugar. And it's what diabetics take because their body no longer properly produces insulin. Something about insulin, though, is if you take too much of it, it will put you into a coma. And so this leads us to something called insulin coma therapy, which was sometimes used from like the 1930s through up until like the 1960s. And the way this would work is a patient would basically be given a large dose of insulin to the point where they'd be put into like a coma for an hour. The coma would be reversed. They would wake up,
and they would do this each day over the course of many days. This was supposed to be used to treat schizophrenia, but as you might imagine, it didn't really work very well, and also had quite a few pretty bad side effects.
Boltzmann brain. So in my opinion, the Boltzmann brain is one of the more interesting thought experiments out there.
So a very simplified explanation would be the universe is extremely large and has existed for an extremely long period of time, right? And thanks to particles just kind of randomly bouncing around in the universe, over a long enough period of time, particles can hypothetically just kind of randomly form any structure you can imagine. And so with enough time and luck, the brain that you exist in could just randomly, spontaneously pop into existence alongside all of your memories and thoughts. And this is what your existence actually is,
as opposed to us kind of like naturally evolving and coming to be like we think we do.
Now, honestly, I need to do a lot more research on this before I can form a complete opinion on this whole concept, but from the stuff I've seen so far, it seems like a lot of people within the science and physics community don't really put a lot of weight into this theory, but also at the same time, it seems like some sources don't rule it out as being technically possible. And out there's even talk of like, is this Boltzmann brain scenario actually more likely than what we think life is? I feel like for this video, I'm just gonna kind of leave it off here because this topic just gets increasingly more complicated the more I look into it. And this isn't really my thing.
Otto Warmbier. Otto Warmbier was a man who, at the age of 21, back in 2016, decided that he wanted to go on a New Year's tour of North Korea. And through a tour group called the Young Pioneers, he managed to go on a 5-day tour of the country. Unfortunately, right at the very end of the tour, when he was literally at the Pyongyang airport, 2 security guards walked up behind him, tapped him on the shoulder, and told him that he should follow them. This would be the last time that Otto Warmbier would ever be seen in person alive. The plane, alongside all the other tour members, ended up leaving without him, and they were told that Otto had suddenly fallen sick and he couldn't return home with them. But 2 months later, North Korea would hold this kind of like press conference thing where they would actually feature Otto Warmbier in it. And on video, Otto Warmbier seems to confess that the reason the North Koreans had held him was because he stole a poster from a hotel. This is apparently a video of him stealing the poster, although, like, as you can tell, it's really hard to identify this person, like, at all. It could be anybody. I would say it almost looks kind of short to be him, but I don't know. It, of course, is often speculated that in this video, Otto's apology is kind of being forced out of him, and, you know, in the background, they might have been threatening him with torture or something. The poster it seems he was trying to steal was a kind of propaganda poster, and it seems as though this poster was at a staff-only area at this hotel he was at, and so, of course, he wasn't supposed to be back there. And I guess something that is worth noting is it seems as though that if a North Korean citizen did steal a poster like this, they would probably face some pretty serious punishments, such as torture or being sent to a labor camp or even worse. Now, after this video came out, the world would not see Otto again for 17 months. No one knew if he was still alive or what his state of health was,
until the North Koreans announced that he was in a coma. And not long after this,
the Americans, by going at some pretty fast and loose negotiation tactics, were able to send some people over there to go get him.
And once they actually got over there to get him, the North Koreans were right.
He was in a coma. The North Koreans say
he was in a coma due to botulism and a sleeping pill.
Although analysis that were ran on his body by American doctors didn't really find any evidence of botulism.
Otto had suffered some pretty bad brain damage due to lack of oxygen, although it was unclear exactly what caused this.
There was one report that suggested that they had seen changes to his teeth. It seemed like his teeth had been moved around and were more crooked than when they had last seen him, which might suggest some kind of torture or something was done to him. Another report mentioned that they found a pretty big scar on his foot, which also could potentially line up with torture. After Otto was returned to the United States, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there was really no chance of him recovering. And so his parents quickly decided to take him off of life support. Kind of one of the more unfortunate elements of this story is kind of the holdup that was keeping the North Koreans from releasing Otto was they were arguing that if one of their own citizens had done this, they would have tortured them. And so why should they treat this American any differently? Of course, Otto should have never been in North Korea in the first place. Like going on a tour there, you're basically accepting that you very well could just die and that's it. But also it goes without saying that like your life ending over a poster on a wall is pretty insane. Sticky notes. So here's a pretty insane story. 11 years ago, a user would make a post to the r/legal subreddit. The subreddit is you basically just ask for legal advice. A user by the name of Bradbury1920 would make a post asking for advice on how to handle what they thought was an overly nosy landlord. They were living in a small apartment, and recently they started finding sticky notes strewn about that had messages on them that seemed to be written from their landlord. And they also claimed that they had set up a security camera to try and capture footage of him in the act, but they claimed that once they'd come back the following morning, the footage was mysteriously deleted off of their computer. Well, what ended up happening was a user on Reddit saw this post and they suggested that the user wasn't actually experiencing somebody coming into their apartment and leaving sticky notes. Instead, they were somehow leaving themselves these sticky notes, but due to a mental health issue or something like carbon monoxide poisoning, they were forgetting they were doing it and then finding the notes the next day and being surprised about it. Well, the user realized that they were also having other symptoms that kind of aligned with carbon monoxide poisoning. They were having pretty bad headaches. And so they got a carbon monoxide detector, and their detector read that they had 100 parts per million in their apartment. Now, I've seen different variations on what the exact safe levels are, but pretty much all sources say that a healthy indoor living space is supposed to be well below 100 parts per million, and 100 parts per million is gonna cause some bad symptoms. And so the 100 parts per million that they had in their apartment wasn't enough to make them like drop dead, but it seems to be definitely enough to give them pretty bad mental issues. Following this incident, it does look like the user was able to fix the carbon monoxide issue. I should also point out, of course, with these Reddit situations, it's always possible that this thing could be fake. This could just be somebody LARPing for attention or whatever, of course. But looking through it, I don't really see any smoking gun that would instantly say it's fake either.
The issue that this person was having was their apartment was above a parking area.
Awesome. FBI Apple encryption dispute. So after the 2015 San Bernardino shooting, the FBI sought to access the iPhone 5C used by one of the shooters. Of course, the investigators argued that the contents of the smartphone could provide them some useful intelligence
about the shooting. The FBI reached out to Apple and basically asked them to create a custom piece of software that they could use to unlock the phone. The software would basically allow them to just infinitely test out passcodes without getting locked out until they found the right one. But Apple actually refused to make this software. They said that it would put users' privacy at risk, and they didn't even want to risk making a piece of software like this because it could potentially get in the hands of other people. It looked like there was actually going to be a pretty significant legal battle between the FBI and Apple.
What's funny though is the dispute kind of just quietly ended, and the reason was because the FBI just ended up finding a third party that could hack into the phone for them, and they just didn't need Apple anymore. And so they ended up getting in anyway.
And so I feel like the main takeaway from the story should be these companies can make all sorts of promises about keeping your data safe and security, but at the end of the day, someone's probably getting in.
Wandering black holes. When a black hole is not gravitationally bound, it can kind of just fly around space aimlessly, and these are known as wandering black holes. One of these was detected in 2022, and it's moving pretty fast, although it's still 5,000 light years away, so I don't think it's much of a problem. How long are you conscious after decapitation? Of course, being decapitated is probably one of the most gruesome ways you could go out, but Of course, a question that comes up a lot with this is like, how long are you really conscious after your head gets chopped off? After the guillotine comes through your neck, would you actually feel your head slide off and hit the deck? This article on PubMed suggests that you'd probably only be conscious for maybe a couple seconds, just due to the sheer amount of blood loss you would suffer, from the cut. Although the paper does go on to admit that it is possible it could be a little bit longer too, but it's pretty much impossible to know for certain. Interestingly, there are quite a few anecdotal stories out there that suggest that you might maintain consciousness for a lot longer than you might imagine after being decapitated. For example, there is a written account by a French physician who in 1905 witnessed the decapitation of a prisoner by the name of Henry Longueuil. Longueuil was a murderer, and so he was sentenced to death by guillotine. After watching the guillotine come down and cut the prisoner's head off, apparently the prisoner's head fell to the ground and landed on the severed neck side, so the face was still visible to people looking on to it. The report says that initially the man's eyelids moved in irregular rhythmic contractions for 5 to 6 seconds until they finally relaxed and partially closed. At this point though, apparently the physician sharply called out Longueuil's name, and at this point the physician apparently saw the eyelids of Longueuil slowly rise up in a controlled manner and the eyes locked onto his. He watched the pupils dilate, and then after a couple seconds the eyelids began falling back down again. At this point, the physician tried calling Longueuil's name again, and the eyelids once again rose, and Longueuil locked eyes again with the physician, apparently this time with an even more penetrating gaze. Eventually though, the eyes would glaze over again and the eyelids would slowly begin shutting. At this point, the physician tried calling Longueuil's name one last time, but this time the head did not react, and it became clear that at this point, he was definitely dead. The physician claims that this whole ordeal lasted about 25 to 30 seconds. This is probably one of the most reliable stories of a decapitated head maintaining consciousness, but even then, the reliability of this story has been called into question. I found one source online arguing that the logistics of this whole ordeal just doesn't make any sense and there's no way this could have possibly happened. The truth is, you'll probably never know how long you maintain consciousness after decapitation until you try it. Early diving bells. Early diving bells were literally a bell that you would be put under and then lowered underwater. They were incredibly cold, and the only light that you had that you'd be able to see with was maybe a small oil lamp. Bad stuff. The Man of the Hole. The Man of the Hole is a name given to an indigenous South American man. His story is really pretty insane and also pretty unfortunate. He is believed to have originally lived with an uncontacted tribe in the Tanaru indigenous area in Brazil. However, in 1995, the last members of his tribe were killed by some illegal miners in the area, and he ended up being the only one left standing. Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Association gained awareness of his existence in 1996, but they kind of just decided to let him be. And pretty much for the rest of his life, he just kind of roamed the Amazon rainforest alone with no other people. There were a couple instances of him interacting with outside people, but he never seemed very interested in them. It is believed that he lived by himself for 30 years in the forest until he eventually passed away in 2022. It is believed that he died of natural causes. It was during a routine patrol in 2022 when a member of the Indigenous Protection Agency found his body covered in feathers, laid in a hammock, dead. It seems like he knew he was going to pass away, and so he covered himself in feathers. The reason he was called the Man of the Hole was throughout the forest, he built over 50 huts for him to live in, and in each of the huts, he would dig a 10-foot hole in the floor. No one is really sure why he dug the holes. Some people might think it was for hunting purposes, or he was hiding in them, or maybe even some sort of religious purpose. It ended up becoming his namesake, though. The Mayday mystery is probably one of the deepest and longest running rabbit holes that remains unsolved till this day. It's kind of a convoluted situation, but here's what's going on. So at the University of Arizona, they have a student newspaper called the Daily Wildcat, and dating back to at least 1981, every May 1st, and sometimes on other random days too, somebody or some group is buying ads in this newspaper and putting in elaborate and convoluted puzzles. These puzzles make references to math and history and politics. They are truly insane. And pretty much all of the puzzles end with this little smiley face guy with big ears here, and he's kind of become the logo of the Mayday mystery. It's extremely hard to approach the puzzles too, because it's never clear if you need to be accounting for information that was in a past issue of the puzzle, or if there are other external factors you need to be accounting for when solving the puzzles. Honestly, sometimes they do seem like they could be the work of a schizophrenic person and they don't really even mean anything, and that has been sometimes speculated. But also considering the amount of time that's been put into these and how long it's running, it would be pretty hard to imagine that this is just a lone schizophrenic person doing this. These puzzles have been showing up in this newspaper for 40 years now, and there's been pretty much no substantial progress in figuring out who is behind these puzzles and what they mean. I'll go ahead and tell you probably one of the most important leads in this mystery that one day might help people solve this case. So you might be thinking, okay, if these puzzles that are being put into this newspaper are so mysterious and esoteric, how are they getting into the newspaper? Surely somebody needs to be contacting the newspaper and buying the spot in the paper, right? Well, it turns out it is clear that starting in the 90s, a Arizona lawyer by the name of Robert Hungerford is the guy who has been buying the spots in the magazine where the puzzles are being placed. He has revealed that there is a group of people behind the puzzles who go by the orphanage. Robert has claimed that he kind of just acts as a connection between the people making the puzzles and the magazine, and his actual involvement with the puzzles and the Mayday mystery are pretty much unclear. Probably the other most revealing thing he's said about the Mayday mystery over the years is, in one interview they did get him to say, there's a society behind it, and this is the unveiling of the program that deals with future events.
And he's also made comments suggesting that the Mayday puzzles are designed to attract new members to this organization. He's also hinted that your best place to start when solving the puzzles would be to start with the theological content, but it doesn't seem like that's worked out very well for people so far.
This Robert Hungerford person is really the only person who has ever been proven to be connected to these puzzles. Robert Hungerford does seem like a pretty smart guy. If someone were to be making puzzles like this, it would probably be someone like him, but there's really no actual evidence that proves that he's behind it. And honestly, with how convoluted and long-running these ads are, it would be really hard to believe that it's just him. You can go on to MaydayMystery.com and look at all of the archived Mayday magazine spots, and you can see people trying to speculate on how to solve them. But seriously, it seems like just very little meaningful progress has ever been made with these. Another kind of interesting element of this story is the guy who runs this Mayday Mysteries website that archives everything is a man by the name of Brian Hauntz. He's probably one of the most devoted people to this mystery, and in interviews he says he just doesn't think anyone's ever gonna solve it. He says that at this point, people from the orphanage have actually contacted him and have begun sending him money and other little things here and there.
And the packages had stamps from all over the world, maybe because they wanted to acknowledge him for his efforts or something like that, but it's not totally clear.
Personally, I don't think there's really any chance of this Mayday mystery thing being solved anytime soon. There are so many parts of the puzzle now that it seems like it's basically impossible to know where to start. And so getting into it would just be like a full-time job.
At the same time, though, I find this mystery pretty interesting because it doesn't seem like that behind this mystery there's just like a college club making these or a schizophrenic person making these. That's usually my takeaway when I see stuff like this, but with the Mayday mystery, I feel like there could be more behind it.
Oh yeah, one other funny thing about this mystery, some people have speculated that the Zodiac Killer is behind it. This is just because there's some imagery in it that they think alludes to the Zodiac Killer. I don't really buy that one though. Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones is a secret society located at Yale University. Of course, Yale is one of the highest ranking Ivy League schools in the world. Till this day though, it's not totally clear what this club actually does, and the exact amount of influence it truly has is unknown. One thing that can be said about it is there have been a lot of high profile and influential people that have come out of this secret society. To mention a few, 3 presidents have been members of Skull and Bones, both George Bush's and William Howard Taft. Also John Kerry who was one of the guys who ran against George Bush.
In interviews, both Bush and Kerry have been asked what Skull and Bones is, and they always just dodge the question, refusing to give any insight.
Also coming out of Skull and Bones is quite a lot other politicians and businessmen and US intelligence members. The secret society dates all the way back to 1832 actually. It was actually founded by William Howard Taft's dad and another politician by the name of William Russell. What is known about it though is every year 15 new members of the senior class are tapped to become the new members of the Skull and Bones Society.
There's an old rumor that back in the day they had an initiation ritual
that involves each member laying into a tomb and describing their sexual history to everybody else. I should also mention that the Skull and Bones Society headquarters is located on Yale's campus, and it's this giant windowless brick building called the Tomb. Skull and Bones members have been seen entering and exiting it before, but no one really knows what it looks like on the inside. This is apparently where the initiation ceremony takes place. Now, online you will find lots of conspiracy theories about what's really going on with Skull and Bones. Stuff about them secretly controlling the US intelligence agencies and stuff like that. I think the most likely thing that's going on with this though is I don't think the Skull and Bones Society has a lot of influence in of itself. Like I don't think they have a lot of like actual direct leverage.
But due to Skull and Bones members probably being encouraged to try and continuously bring in new members that they feel like have high potential,
the Skull and Bones Society might kind of turn into like a really powerful networking opportunity for these people, and it might kind of just be a way for really elite rich people to get connected. Benjamin Franklin had bodies in his basement. Benjamin Franklin was a boarder at a house in London at 36 Craven Street. In 1775, though, Benjamin Franklin decided to leave his home in London and move to the United States. 2 centuries later, though, in the 1990s, some conservationists were trying to do some restorative work on the house, and they were doing a little bit of digging, and they accidentally stumbled on 24 bodies that were buried in his basement. There was like this kind of undocumented room near the garden with no windows, and there's just a ton of bodies piled up inside of it. Some of the bones might have belonged to children. Now, this is pretty ridiculous to hear, but what is said to be the most likely thing that happened was a friend of his by the name of William Hewson was running an illegal anatomy school in his basement. Studying anatomy at the time was pretty frowned upon, and so it kind of needed to be done under secrecy, and it is speculated that Benjamin Franklin willingly let his friend do this in his basement and just never told anybody, even after he died. And also, the bodies were probably grave robbed. Like, it's not like his friend was murdering people and then studying their bodies. It was probably he was like digging them up and then looking at them. Mariana UFO film. The Mariana UFO film is probably the single earliest example of a supposed UFO being caught on motion picture. In 1950, in Great Falls, Montana, a minor league baseball coach was walking around his stadium before a game when suddenly up in the sky he could see what seemed to be two metallic orbs moving in tandem through the air. Miraculously, he actually had a 16mm camera in his car that he quickly ran and got and started recording the orbs and capturing the video that you're now looking at. In an interview, he said that he believed them to be about 50 feet wide, and in this video, they're about 150 feet away from each other. At one point, the United States Air Force did analyze the footage, and they initially said that it might be the reflection off of some F-19 jets, but that theory isn't bulletproof. People have considered meteors or birds or balloons, but none of those have been proven. Some have speculated that the baseball coach might have just faked it to get attention, but once again, that theory isn't really perfectly proven either. Really, there's not a great explanation out there. So what do you guys think? Toynbee tiles. So a Toynbee tile is a license plate size tile
that are plastered to the ground.
And typically what they say is a message that reads, Toynbee idea in movie 2001 resurrect dead on planet Jupiter. Although sometimes there's Toynbee tiles that say other things along these lines. What makes these Toynbee tiles interesting not only is the weird message on them, but they were showing up in cities across America, plastered to the ground with pretty much no explanation. Some also showed up in South America. They also showed up in like pretty peculiar places, like in the middle of busy roads. These things started showing up in the 80s, and for a long time, no one had really any idea who was behind these. But it seems like the most popular explanation now is it is believed that these tiles were made by a lone man who lived in Philadelphia. As to how he managed to get these all over the world, it's possible he had some help, but one of the main things he was believed to have done is he modified his car so that he had cut out the floor of the passenger side of the vehicle, and what he could do was literally drive his car and drop a tile onto the ground quickly and then just drive off, no detection. As to what this message means and why the Philadelphia man wanted to spread it so much is really anyone's guess, possibly mental health issues, but it is said that this message was influenced by a autobiography made by Arnold Toynbee and the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, and it led to the Philadelphia man to believe that in the future, humans are responsible for creating the afterlife, and so it's up to them to basically create an afterlife on Jupiter that allows for humans' dead molecules to be reconstructed. Yeah. What really goes on in Bohemian Grove? Located in Northern California, there is a 4¼ square mile plot of land known as Bohemian Grove. And every summer for over 100 years, Bohemian Grove has hosted a 3-week retreat for its members. Getting on the guest list for Bohemian Grove is notoriously difficult, and it's typically reserved for the world's most rich and elite and wealthy people. Historically, members of Bohemian Grove have been very tight-lipped about what really goes on in the Grove during the retreat, and so there's been a lot of speculation about all the strange rituals and things that they might be doing on the inside. Probably one of the best accounts of what actually goes on inside of Bohemian Grove comes from an investigative journalist by the name of Philip Wise, who in the summer of 1989 was actually able to infiltrate the Grove and experience the retreat for himself. Although he never completely revealed how he managed to get in, what he does say is there are some anti-Bohemian Grove groups out there who have put together this kind of like underground railroad type thing that can be used to kind of smuggle people into the event, and he was able to use this. And he says that once he actually made it in to the Grove, security wasn't very strict about checking people, and he was just able to get away with making up stories about who he was and how he got in. From his report, Bohemian Grove turned out to largely just be basically a giant party for members to kind of relax, and some members would take it as kind of an opportunity to talk business or network. He says that when he went in 1989, former presidents such as Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon were there and gave speeches. The entire event was set up outside amongst the redwood trees, and they'd set up a bunch of amenities outside, and the staff would serve them food,
and members of the Bohemian Club
put together other live entertainment like shows and stuff like that. Bohemian Grove and the whole Bohemian Club kind of has a lot of different symbols and lore and stories surrounding them. And so a lot of the decorations and live shows would revolve around these things. Like, for example, one of the most prominent symbols of Bohemian Grove is the owl. And so a lot of different like live rituals or live shows
include owl symbols.
Probably one of the strangest details that this journalist mentions was that apparently guests at this retreat
were kind of encouraged to just piss wherever they wanted on the grounds.
All members of Bohemian Grove are male, and it said that they were kind of doing it for camaraderie's sake or something like that. Although online you'll see a lot of conversation about Bohemian Grove having some sort of like satanic cabal going on or something like that. I haven't really seen any hard evidence that suggests you should put a lot of weight into that. I would say though is that Bohemian Grove probably does act as an incredibly powerful networking opportunity for the elites of the world. Ball lightning. Ball lightning is an insane weather phenomenon that is real that no one really has a good explanation for. And what it is it's a ball of lightning or electricity
or plasma or some light emitting material
about the size of a basketball that just kind of floats around. And sometimes they fizzle out quietly, or sometimes they like go out with a bang. There are tons of anecdotal stories of people witnessing ball lightning, sometimes dating back hundreds of years. Probably one of the most notable sightings I've read about comes from a professor by the name of Roger Jennison, who miraculously witnessed ball lightning while flying from New York to Washington overnight in 1963. What happened is they were flying in a thunderstorm and the airplane got struck with lightning, and a few seconds later, Roger witnessed ball lightning emerge from the cabin of the plane and then float down the aisle and then disappear. Fortunately, people have actually finally captured video of ball lightning in Alberta, Canada. There's a thunderstorm and a pretty big ball lightning emerged, and this family caught it on video in their backyard. Now, till this day, there is not a single agreed on, like, scientific, technical explanation of how ball lightning comes to be.
There are a lot of different explanations that have been thrown around, but for example, one
comes from a study that came out of China in 2014, where they suggest that ball lightning happens when lightning strikes a certain type of soil in a very particular way, thus causing the soil to kind of like do the whole ball lightning thing. But this explanation is not proven like at all, so no one really knows. Guided bullets. So that's right, the United States has access to guided bullets. A bullet that you can shoot and then the trajectory can be changed mid-flight to hit its target.
Actually, it was all the way back in 2014
that DARPA showed these things off, and the demonstration video literally shows a sniper purposely missing his target, and then the bullet like gets back on track and then hits the target. The exact extent of the capabilities of these bullets isn't really totally known, but I mean, it looks pretty good. They named this technology the X-Acto device, and it really makes you think, like, so you're telling me, like, if they want to, they have access to a bullet that they can hit extremely precise targets from a distance with extreme reliability. Makes you think a little bit when they could have been using that. The sun gun. So, of course, during World War II, the Nazis threw around a lot of different ideas for weapons that they could use to try and get the upper hand in the war. And one idea they considered was creating a sun gun. The idea of how this might work was they would put a bunch of enormous mirrors into orbit, and they'd be able to control where these mirrors were aimed so they could direct sunlight at targets on Earth and just be able to just melt cities or boil oceans at will. Although this was really nothing more than just an idea at the time, steam power. So when people typically think of steam-powered machines, usually what comes to mind are
trains and maybe like boats.
But what a lot of people don't know is that there were actually pretty successful attempts at cars and even planes that were steam-powered. For example, the fastest steam-powered car went 148 miles per hour, and the Vesler steam plane was an actual thing, and it actually worked pretty well. That could fly on its own power, and apparently was so quiet that during demonstrations, when pilots were flying over the crowd could actually hear the pilots yell at them from above.
Man missing 90% of his brain.
Okay, so in 2007, a 44-year-old French guy went to the doctor's office due to him suffering a mild weakness in his left leg. The doctors, of course, ended up running some tests on him, and after running a brain scan on him, what they found was pretty unsettling. He had a pretty bad case of hydrocephalus, which is when there's a buildup of fluid in the brain, which often causes neuron damage and causes the brain to be kind of pushed around in damaging ways.
Now, I'm not going to show the actual image of the CT scan for copyright reasons, but this image is kind of a recreation of what it looked like. You can go check out the real image if you want. It actually looks like there's more fluid in it than this.
Now, what's pretty fascinating about this story is despite all of this fluid buildup in his brain and these scans looking pretty serious,
the report seems to describe him as a guy who is living a pretty normal life.
He did score a 75 on an IQ test, which is of course lower than average, but he was very normal socially. He had a wife and kids and a job. It doesn't sound like you really would have been able to pick him out in a crowd. Now, one of the things I have to mention about this story is in doing research with it,
some sources will tell you that he was missing 90% of his brain.
Although I can't figure out exactly where this number comes from.
The medical journal that this was originally listed in doesn't give any specific details on exactly how much of his brain was damaged.
One other source I saw basically says that his brain had undergone quite a significant amount of damage, but they don't seem to put like an exact number on it. Dogs are developing eyebrows.
A 2019 study from Duke University
found that dogs not only have much more prominent eyebrow muscles compared to wolves,
but dogs' eyebrows also move around a lot more than wolves.
The researchers go on to suggest that due to humans liking eyebrows,
as we were domesticating wolves into dogs,
we knowingly or unknowingly selected for dogs that had more prominent eyebrows, and they're continuing to develop.
Of course, this is just one study with a limited sample size, and their main argument is speculative. And other studies have actually cast doubt on this speculation, but it is pretty crazy to think how much of a reflection of us dogs may really be. If you enjoyed this video, you should really consider subscribing. It really helps me out and helps me make videos like this more often. Check out my second channel to see my super secret project, and I'll see you guys later.